that looks expensive. Hello. The United States has a tendency of throwing perfectly good things out of perfectly good aircraft. From people to vehicles, supplies, and boxes full of scary missiles, for the American military, if it can be chucked out the back of a plane, it absolutely will. Today, I want to talk about how the US has weaponized gravity, the new airborne tech that's a fresh take on an old classic, and whether or not we're just wasting our time on a strategy that would get a lot of dudes schwacked. Feet and knees together, the like and subscribe button, and let's talk about it. Before we talk more about the jumpy boys, I need to tell you about my Pepperbox channel while I'm sitting in the cuck chair of a hotel room, because I think you should watch it. I worked really hard on it, but I can't show it on YouTube. Pepperbox is an amazing creator-built streaming service where you can find exclusive content from myself, like my new series, Acquisitions Anonymous, where I do deep dives on cutting-edge and sometimes questionable military technology. You can also see all of my normal YouTube content, but completely ad-free, and you get access to all the exclusive content, not just from me, but from all of your other favorite creators like Chris Cappy, Habitual Line Crosser, and all of your favorite gun tubers too. And all of that with just a single subscription. Pepperbox works just like your other favorite streaming services, only better. With zero ads, no censorship, secret merch store access, and tons of two-way giveaways as well. Pepperbox is available on all major platforms where you watch everything else, like your desktop, phone, gaming console, and your Roku apps when you're not being hypnotized by the Roku City video pan. The best part is that if you use my link, pepperbox.tv/joinjustintaylor, you can get a 14-day free trial and then $7.99 after that. So if you do want to watch the episode of my new show, Acquisitions Anonymous, click that link now and head over there. Airborne operations, a storied military strategy that has been compressing spines since the dawn of the 20th century. Fun fact, when he wasn't finger blasting French people, our boy Benjamin Franklin actually envisioned an early form of airborne operations using hot air balloons, shortly after the first manned flight of one in 1784. But since then, airborne operations have become a military asset around the entire world, with the goal of surprise attacks, resupply in harsh environments, and keeping textile factories that specialize in maroon-colored felt in business. We're going to start our discussion by looking at paratroopers specifically, mostly because I'm going in order of cheapest to most expensive things we throw out of planes, and to no one's surprise, the cheapest thing is the 19-year-old PFC getting paid slightly less than a Starbucks barista. You might think to yourself, why would someone volunteer to jump out of a perfectly good plane? Well, there's two answers for this. First, the consequences of refusing to jump verge on torture. And second, it's the easiest way to make an extra $200 a month without having to do gay stuff. Airborne drops used to be all the rage back in the day. However, the easier it became to shoot planes down, the more the capability came into question. It might come as a surprise, but cargo jets are very easy targets. You'd have better luck trying to hide an elephant in an empty room than you would trying to hide a C-17 from a Chinese radar dish. And that's best case scenario. If you're going to be throwing out America's finest, you have to fly low and slow, making it even easier to shoot at you. At most, that cargo aircraft is going to be flying around 1,250 feet above the ground. A large portion of that is the practical limitations of the parachutes themselves that we use. Unlike pilots who had to punch out of their plane, it is absolutely not a war crime to play duck hunter with paratroopers. Therefore, it is in your best interest to get to the ground as quickly as possible. Airborne ops use static line parachutes for automatic parachute deployment. That's what that yellow thing is hooked into the wire above them. This simplifies training a lot. All a guy has to do for a successful parachute deployment is a decent jump out the side, and the only cord yanking they have to worry about is on the reserve if their main doesn't do the job. And if the reserve fails, well, at least you'll never have to do parachute duty ever again. It also helps keep landing patterns consistent, so planers can easily predict where guys are going to land on a DZ, which is incredibly useful because, unlike those Navy SEAL jump team stunts at football games, the parachutes that these guys are using have about as much steering as a train going in a straight line. I don't care what anyone says, those little steering handles on the T-11 don't do shit in terms of steering anything, and I'm tired of being gaslit into believing that they do. Unlike skydiving parachutes that gently float you down to a comfortable landing, a static line chute slows you down just enough to not literally die on impact. That said, it's better to risk a broken leg from falling too fast than it is gently floating towards the ground being an easy target. All that is to say is that airborne operations are incredibly risky. The planes are giant targets, the paratroopers have nothing in terms of armor, vehicle support, and logistics are basically non-existent. There was that one guy who did a jump with a minigun strapped to him, so maybe strategies are changing. But in the 21st century, American airborne forces are generally focused on just one kind of objective: airport seizure. Not to be confused with airport seizures, meaning when you have a seizure at the airport. Known officially as a joint forcible entry, the idea is to take an enemy force by surprise, taking over one of their airfields, and then immediately bringing in heavier reinforcements that can be carried on a plane that can't be airdropped. Russia tried that sort of in the opening hours of the Ukraine war via air assault troops, but it didn't quite work out for them. And it makes me wonder what the VDV music video guy is up to these days. But large-scale airborne operations are kind of in the same ballpark as large-scale marine beach landings. We haven't done a real one in a very, very long time. The ones we have done were against people who had zero hope of defeating it, and any discussion of them is built upon mountains of assumptions, guesses, and hypotheticals, making it the perfect topic to argue with someone down in the comments. Will we ever see another large-scale airborne drop? I would lean on probably not. RIP mustard stains. But that doesn't mean that airborne troops aren't useful, because these days they act more as air mobile troops. The fact that they're in a constant standby rate and can rapidly deploy means you can have a brigade's worth of combat power anywhere in the world in just a few hours, assuming it has an airstrip at least. Now, in order to make the air part of airborne operations a reality, you need something to get you up into the air in the first place. And the United States has 3 things specifically built to do just that. In order of smallest to biggerest, we have the C-130, the C-17, and the often forgotten, yet my personal favorite, the C-5. In total, we have about 430 C-130s, 220 C-17s, and 52 C-5s. And this is where the plane guys in my audience perk their ears up so they can get ready to say something mean to me. In a very rough sense, the C-130 is for tactical airlift. It carries the least amount of stuff compared to the other two, and it can't carry tanks, but it can land on short and unapproved airstrips. So it doesn't need a full-on airport to land somewhere, meaning it can logistically support smaller units in more austere places. C-17s are a mixture of tactical and strategic, meaning they can directly support smaller operations or be part of a larger theater-wide logistics effort. Not only can they shit out paratroopers, they can also drop off tank. Tank, not tanks, just one. If tanks plural is more your style, then the C-5 Galaxy is for you. These massive aircraft that seem to defy gravity every time they take off can carry a whopping 2 tanks at a time, meaning you only need 7 of them to move one single company of tanks from the US over to some random airfield in Europe. Moral of the story, if you want tanks in your battle, you should probably just pre-position them just in case. We used to have the ability to throw tanks out of aircraft, when we were a real country and Cracker Barrel had an indoor smoking section. The Army used to chuck the Sheridan out of the back of C-130s like it was going out of style, or just skirting the airstrip so they had a better chance of not turning the ground into a crater. There's only been one instance of tanks being deployed like this in history, when 10 Sheridans were dropped out the back of C-141s in Panama. Unfortunately, one had a catastrophic parachute malfunction and very quickly converted from tank to pieces of tank. I imagine that tank crew was probably pretty pissed they missed out on a rare combat jump because some rigger didn't do their job correctly. The word you just heard me say was rigger. A 92 Romeo, the guys and the gals in the Army that physically pack the parachutes. Sometimes a little extra enunciation goes a long way. Occasionally, the parachutes we strap to things fail at the one thing it was designed to do, and sends that piece of gear slamming into the ground. This is called burning in, and it's a family favorite viewing activity, whether it be a truck or a scared teenager who just wanted money for college. In 2025, we still throw Vicks out the back of planes, but the heaviest thing you're going to find is an up-armored Humvee that just hasn't been replaced yet. American paratroopers nowadays will jump with the M1301 Infantry Squad Vehicle, or ISV. These are pretty sparse in the everything department, but that's the point. They're light, they're fast, and most importantly, they're cheap. I give it 5 years before this thing weighs more than a tank because we start welding extra shit to it. But airborne tanks specifically are an entirely different problem to try to solve. You need something with a big enough punch so it can actually make a difference in a ground fight, but in a small enough package that it can be airdropped. The tanks we have now are air mobile, sort of, in the sense that an Abrams will physically fit inside of a C-17, but they can't hit the ground fighting like a dedicated airborne tank could. Sheridan's it kinda sucked, and the replacement designs we tried out lacked both the armor and firepower of a dedicated main battle tank. But let that be a lesson to you, life is about compromise. Compromise and billions of wasted taxpayer dollars just for another failed prototype Wikipedia page. But one thing about that compromise is while no, airborne tanks leave some things to be desired, tank is better than no tank. A little extra 105mm cannon never hurt, and I'm sure we'll figure it out eventually. The US has tried twice now to develop a tank that we would hand off to the airborne forces, and twice we have stared the answer in the face and made the wrong decision. But that's a video for a different time. But throwing out just a bunch of supplies for the grunts on the ground is one of the less exciting, but arguably most useful things we do with airborne operations, because it's a very fast way to resupply an area where traditional resupply isn't possible. We literally saved half of Berlin from the Soviets in the late 40s because we were dropping literally tens of thousands of tons worth of stuff every day for years. Believe it or not, these kinds of supply drops we throw out the back of planes navigate to their landing zone with a very complex system called HOPE. HOPE is not a military acronym. I am referring to the English word hope, meaning a feeling of expectation and desire for a certain thing to happen, because these things operate off the kick it and pray method. If you're not one to rely on divine intervention for determining the impact zone of your precious Chili Mac MRE crate, you can always use the JPADS, or Joint Precision Airdrop Delivery System. This system swaps out the traditional parachute for a steerable one, and connects it to a GPS receiver that can fly it up to 20 miles away. The DoD is currently working on a longer range version, which they are coining the Long Range JPADS. 0 points for creativity, but I do appreciate the clarity on it. But this will push that distance out to hundreds of miles by attaching a rocket motor to the whole thing, which, again, 0 points for creativity, but I am a fan of using the Wile E. Coyote method of developing military technology. Extending the range on these gives you a lot more options, because one launch point can support multiple locations, instead of having to make multiple drops at multiple locations. Plus, it lets the plane turn around sooner in the trip, so they can get back to doing other plane-related activities sooner. But sometimes the payload that you need to drop out the back of that plane isn't just a bunch of ammo or cards written by grade schoolers saying that they hope you don't die. Sometimes it's a crate of cruise missiles that convert a normal cargo plane into a harbinger of death that makes the AC-130 look like a flying airsoft gun. We are of course talking about the Rapid Dragon missile pallet system. Basically, these are boxes that fall out the back ramp of aircraft just like anything else, but once they stabilize as they fall, they fire out a huge mixture of long-range missiles at dozens of targets at once. The beautiful thing about this system is that you don't have to change the plane configuration at all in order for it to work. Most of the time, whenever you want your plane to do something new, you have to spend millions in research, upgrades, and testing, but not with the Rapid Dragon. That might sound like it fits more in the convenient category rather than game-changing category, but I cannot stress enough how much that portion of the fact is game-changing. If you are bad guy country fighting the US because, I don't know, the tariffs for your bespoke dragon dildos got too expensive, you are going to have to deal with the American Air Force. If you're the guy running the anti-air missile system for dildo exporter country, you're probably going to focus your efforts on taking out things like fighters and bombers, because those are the ones that give your military the most issues. But if America starts gobbling up Rapid Dragon systems, the number of platforms you need to worry about near your airspace just went up by over 550 platforms. And since you don't know if a C-130 is only carrying supplies or a box of cruise missiles, it forces you to treat every American cargo plane like a potential gunship, or risk trying to guess which ones have Rapid Dragons and which ones just have food pallets. And unfortunately for the country with the sex toy-based economy, all of these munitions used in Rapid Dragon are standoff munitions. They're designed to be fired from very, very far away, to the point that the C-17 carrying them will be nowhere near the danger zone before it drops its payload. One of the big ones being tested is the AGM-158 JASM, which the part of my brain that's still 14 years old wants to call something else, but we won't go there today. The latest version of these, the AGM-158D, which is still in the experimental phase, could hit targets 1,000 miles away. That's roughly the distance between Los Angeles and Seattle. At that point, the C-130 would probably just be doing laps around the airport it took off from when it fires these things. To use a more politically insensitive example, a C-130 or any other kind of cargo aircraft could hover around an airport in Berlin and strike Moscow. And in my opinion, at that point, just launch them from the ground. But if you're the military guy that happens to have a longer than regulation haircut and regularly goes on podcasts, you're probably more interested in a slightly different insertion method than the average grunt. Here, insertion method strictly means how a person physically gets to the objective. If you are said special boy, you're probably going to get some practice in halo and related style jumps. Halo stands for high altitude low opening, and as the name implies, is when you jump from a high altitude out of a plane, but don't open your parachute until you're pretty close to the ground. The first recorded use of this strategy was actually way back in 1964, when Naked Snake jumped into the USSR. Halo jumps are basically how you turn a human being into a ballistic missile. Generally speaking, these jumps happen at 20 to 25,000 feet above sea level, but have been known to go higher. That lets the aircraft stay out and away from enemy tracking as much as possible, while the low opening lets the jumpers quickly get down because of gravity. At those altitudes, the air is rare, as they say, so you're going to need some extra gear like breathing equipment in order to keep your O2 levels where they need to be. For the most part, dudes will be popping chutes at 2,500 to 4,000 AGL, still over double what static line jumpers deploy at. But sometimes you gotta harness your inner sugar glider, and that's where hey-ho comes in. Hey-ho, or high altitude high opening, is used when getting to the ground as fast as possible isn't the priority, or if you want to put some extra miles between the plane and the target. These will still be conducted at upwards of 30,000 feet, but jumpers will deploy their chute just after a few seconds, and can glide over 20 miles from that height. During my research, I was not able to find any examples of a low altitude high opening because that would involve some form of teleportation. And lay low, or low altitude low opening, is when you deploy your parachute while jumping off a building in order to avoid fall damage. Of course, the United States is not the only country with an air force, and certainly not the only one shitting stuff out of cargo aircraft. I want to start off the foreign section of the video with the Nigerian paratroopers landing on random stuff. Not because it's relevant to the discussion, but because I find humor in their pain. Imagine if those Ghanaian super soldiers teamed up with the Nigerian paratroopers. They would be unstoppable. Russia, of course, have an entire branch of their military just for airborne operations, the VDV. And while that made more sense in a Cold War 20th century context, they've done a lot more trench digging than airplane jumping in the last few years. They're also the only country that I know that will drop an airborne vehicle from the sky with the crew already inside of it, and there is no amount of money on Earth that would make me do that willingly. China has 3 airborne brigades that fall under their air force rather than their army, which is an interesting choice, but I'm sure they have their reasons. France has the 11th Parachute Brigade, made up of several regiments and a sprinkling of Special Forces peoples, and includes the Foreign Legion. These guys have been very busy over the last few decades, fulfilling a centuries-old time-honored French tradition, killing Africans. The Brits have their Parachute Regiment, the Paras, but these are more of an elite specialized infantry outfit compared to their American counterparts, who throw anyone with a pulse out the side of a C-17. Italy and Poland have their own jumpy boys, along with Indonesia, Brazil, India, and a handful of others. But why? We can all agree that throwing supplies out of an aircraft is useful, but is people? A standard infantry unit is going to get to an objective regardless of what the weather looks like. Rain or shine, that poor grunt is going to lug his way to the X. While American airborne forces typically get the latest and greatest gear, and often the best training the conventional army has to offer, having 2 night vision tubes on your noggin instead of just 1 isn't going to magically make an enemy armored column go away. Traditionally speaking, airborne forces have the least when it comes to organic firepower in their formation. The opportunity cost of deploying your guys via parachute is also massive. If you got an airborne brigade in the rear gearing up for a drop, you're leaving some of your most elite infantry out of the fight the rest of the military is engaged in. And that C-17 carrying the actual troopers is one less C-17 that could be doing something else. It's easy to say, oh, better to have and not need than need and not have, but it's a sum-zero game. Having a portion of your army be super light airborne forces means you're sacrificing other capabilities. It's a strategy and doctrine that has to be constantly trained, funded, and put into practice. It's not just an extra ability you have for free. Personally, I lean more towards the 90-10 not worth it ratio. Is a joint forcible entry a decisive theater level action that could win or lose a war depending on how it goes? Yes, they are a very big deal, and with enough shaping operations and risk management, could theoretically be pulled off. But it depends on who we're fighting. Are we going to pull a JFE on Russia? Probably not. And I would only see it happening against China if it happened on a random airfield on some random island that we already had quartered off somehow. But could we pull it off against someone like Iran or North Korea? Yeah, probably. It serves the function that, if pulled off correctly, could make a campaign take only a week instead of months. In an actual peer fight, we would probably be better off just leveraging those infantry guys already on the ground in areas where they would excel at. Once we start entering the near peer rather than strictly peer fight, the ability for us to put a cargo plane in hostile territory and not have it shot down goes up exponentially. At least if the recent operations in Iran have taught us anything. But still, losing even one C-17 before the drop means you lost an entire company's worth of troopers at once. And unless your plan is rock solid, just because you take over an airfield, doesn't mean you can manage to hold on to it. So my hot take for the video is that I don't think they're relevant, unless we're invading a country that has the same GDP as Pulaski County, Arkansas. In which case, go ham. I think it'd make a cool post on the combat footage subreddit. And on that note, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.